This isn't really a recipe for sourdough. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, so what I'm going to do in this video is really point out what I did wrong. First, I'm adding about 1,000 grams of flour. This is going to yield about 2 900 gram loaves and 700 grams of water, so that's going to make it a 70% hydration dough. I like to pour the water around the flour, almost leaving a little peak. That way you get a little island of flour in an ocean of water. I like to imagine little flower people bathing on a flower beach. I'm going to come in with my hand and just incorporate all the water into the flour until it's homogeneous. This is probably my least favorite part. It can get quite sticky, so I like to get through it as fast as possible. Now I'm going to leave this for about half an hour, let autolyse take place. That's just going to make the dough a lot easier to handle. Now I have 20 grams of salt, that's 2%, and I am just kneading that salt into there. Usually I would reserve maybe 50 grams of water so I can incorporate the salt into the water and then the salt water into the dough, and that just makes it more homogeneous, but I forgot this time. So my starter's been sitting for about 5 hours after I fed it. It's 100% rye. It's about a 10 to 10 to 1 feeding ratio, so it's not going to be very acidic, which is very good. Already you can see how this autolyse made the dough super smooth and elastic. I'm going to break off a little bit of that dough, use it as a gauge to see the percent volume increase during bulk fermentation. I made about 5% more dough than I needed to expressly for this purpose. Now for the first stretch and fold, I'm going to come in with a soaking wet hand straight out of the sink, and I am going to do 4 90-degree folds. Stretch, fold, or stretch and slap. It's always pretty satisfying. So I guess I should take this time to go over what mistakes I made. So I think the biggest mistake I made for this was the bulk fermentation. I usually make sourdough at about 70 degrees, and today was a very hot day, so the temperature was around 75 to 80 degrees. Now, I would usually ferment for about 10 hours. That usually yields a nice, properly fermented loaf, but because it was hotter, I didn't really have it in my mind how long I needed to ferment. I looked at telltale signs, but sometimes you can miss a few things. For example, I didn't try the window pane test, and it smelled too floury. So we can see the about 30% increase in volume. That looks good. It feels good. So yeah, it still smelled floury, ripe, not sweet necessarily like it should have. So I definitely should have kept it going maybe an hour or two longer. So here we can see a nice dough waterfall. Holy crap, that looks cool. Just shows you how strong that dough is already. Now I'm just going to separate it. It's always hard separating it with this amount of dough, but you get there eventually. And I'm going to do some pre-shape. I'm not trying the 4 folds over, blah 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 blah. just getting into a roughly circular shape and then flipping it and pulling it taut. Need to be careful not to pull it too tight as to rip the gluten. I think I did pull it a bit too tight, so that could have also been an issue that led to not perfect loaves in the end. Now I'm gonna let these rest for about 15 minutes to let the gluten relax and start the final shape. Sprinkling with flour, that's gonna make it super easy to handle. I flip, and even though I bake boules, I like to use the petard shaping method. I fold it like an envelope, then do the classic pinch, tuck, pinch, tuck, pinch, tuck, and pull that taut. Make sure to hide the seams on the sides, which is what I'm doing right now. It's not perfect, but practice makes perfect, so we'll get there eventually. And I just slide it into a bowl lined with floured parchment paper. A lot of people think you need bannetons, but I find, it works just as fine with like a 7-inch bowl. Gonna cover those and put them in the fridge overnight for maybe 16 hours to cold ferment. Now I have a baking sheet under the Dutch oven that's going to prevent burning, and I've tested 500 degrees, but I found that 450 actually works best for me to get the best oven spring. I'm going to pull the dough out after the oven's been preheating for maybe half an hour to 45 minutes. Gonna flip it out upside down, and I'm gonna score it and do a nice shallow score, maybe 45 degrees tangent to the dough. And I'm gonna plop that in the heated Dutch oven with the lid on. And let's see it, let some steam escape. It's a decent rise, but it wasn't what I was expecting. And I think that's mainly due to the bulk ferment actually. And yeah, it looks good. You see it's a nice ear. I think the ear is more of a product of how I scored rather than the bulk ferment. Here's the second loaf. I think this one came out a bit better. This was in the metal bowl rather than the plastic bowl. I think the shape of the metal bowl actually gave it a slightly higher rise just because the shape it was in when cold. So as you can see, the bottom isn't burnt. That's one thing I learned. You put the sheet tray under the Dutch oven, at least for my oven, and that always works for me. It prevents the bottom from burning. Bake them for about 15 minutes after the lid came off. So yeah, they look good. This is the first loaf, and let's cut into it. Let's see how it went. Is the crumb good? Yeah, it's okay. You see kind of the triangular shape of the bread? That's a telltale sign of underfermentation. So are those big air pockets on top. And the slightly gummy crumb near the bottom of the loaf. It looks good, it tastes good. One thing to notice is how the crust is pretty golden brown, but there are some pale spots. During bulk fermentation, the yeast break down the sugars in the flour into simple sugars, and those caramelize very easily as compared to complex carbs. You can tell if it's underfermented if you don't get that golden brown color. If you get a more pale loaf, like this loaf for example, this was one of maybe the first 10 loaves I ever made, came out pretty pale, and that's because the yeast didn't have time during bulk fermentation to break down the sugars. So next time when I bake at this temperature, I'm gonna probably give it maybe 2 more hours, and that will help a lot. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video, hope you learned something, and see you next time.